Chapter 1. A Child Taken by the Force. In the year 3994, before the Battle of Yavin, in the quiet reaches of the Outer Rim, where the Republic's maps were still dotted with half-known worlds, and the pull of civilization had not yet drowned out the silence of the stars, a boy was born whose destiny would shape the galaxy. His name, the name the galaxy would remember, was Revan, yet the truth of his beginning remained shrouded in uncertainty, hidden as though the Force itself veiled it from curious eyes. The Jedi who found him never revealed his parents, his bloodline, or the soil where his first cries were heard. Some whispered that such omissions were deliberate, for in time it seemed as if Revan belonged more to the galaxy itself than to any one people or place. Whatever his origin, the only constant in his early life was the power of the Force, a tide that flowed through him with the strength of a storm. It is said the Jedi searchers who felt his presence as an infant described it like a beacon flaring across hyperspace, a brilliance impossible to ignore. When they carried him away from his family, there were no goodbyes remembered, no lullabies carried into adulthood, only the cold certainty of destiny and the Order's belief that such gifts demanded discipline, that such fire must be contained before it consumed the galaxy. From his first days in the Jedi Temple, Revan stood apart. To most younglings, the halls of Coruscant's temple were overwhelming, vaulted ceilings, stern masters, endless lessons in restraint. For Revan, the temple was not prison but challenge, not a place of rules but of doors waiting to be opened. Even as a boy, he absorbed the knowledge at a pace that startled his instructors. He read the ancient texts with eyes too young to fully grasp their depth, yet his questions revealed a mind constantly pushing beyond the boundaries of what was safe to ask. Where other initiates accepted the Jedi Code as unassailable, Revan wanted to know why compassion must always triumph over passion, why detachment was praised and attachment condemned, why curiosity toward the mysteries of the Force was sometimes treated as dangerous. His inquiries unsettled some of the more rigid masters, who saw in him the seeds of rebellion, yet others, wiser and more far-seeing, recognized not arrogance but hunger, the rare hunger of a mind unwilling to stop at half-truths, a spirit destined either to illuminate or to consume. As Revan grew, he sought out training from a wide array of teachers. He refused to be molded in the image of any single master. In combat, he studied every form he could, tracing the elegant flourishes of Makashi, the acrobatic sweeps of Ataru, the patient defense of Soresu, even the raw ferocity of Juyo, styles many considered too volatile for one so young. His lightsaber was more than a weapon. It was an extension of his restless spirit, always evolving, never content to stay within one tradition. In the archives, he buried himself among the holocrons, chasing the words of philosophers long forgotten, stitching together fragments of wisdom into a tapestry that was uniquely his own. Other students memorized lessons to repeat them later. Revan dissected them, challenged them, reshaped them until they revealed their hidden core. He was never content with the surface when the depths waited just beyond. Yet brilliance is never solitary. Every flame casts both heat and shadow, and for Revan, the companion who shared both was a fellow initiate named Alec. Where Revan's mind was sharp and restless, Alec's was steady, offering loyalty without question. The two became inseparable, sparring in the training halls until exhaustion left them laughing on the temple floor, debating philosophy beneath the starry windows until the night gave way to morning. It was said that if Revan was the storm, Alec was the anchor. If Revan's voice carried the fire of command, Alec's presence tempered it with patience. To many of their peers, the two were simply friends rising through the ranks together. To the masters, though, it was clear that Revan was the brighter flame, and Alec, though gifted in his own right, would forever orbit as his companion, loyal and steadfast. In their bond lay a glimpse of the future, a leader who inspired and a follower who steadied, a partnership that would test the galaxy itself. The council took note of Revan early. They praised his talent, yes, but more than that, they watched his ambition with unease. Even in youth, he carried himself with a charisma rare among Jedi, the kind of presence that could move hearts as easily as blades. Masters whispered in council chambers that he was destined for greatness, perhaps even a seat among them one day. Yet with that promise came fear, for the brightest stars burn hottest, and the hottest flames cast the longest shadows. Would Revan be a light for the galaxy, or the fire that consumed it? In their caution, they counseled restraint, urging him to temper his curiosity, to surrender his questions to the wisdom of tradition. But Revan was not one to surrender to silence. If the Force was infinite, he reasoned, then so too must be the paths toward truth. And if the galaxy itself was alive with mysteries, why should any be forbidden? Thus, from the very beginning, Revan's destiny unfolded as a paradox. He was the perfect Jedi student, yet never truly obedient. He mastered every lesson, yet never stopped questioning the lesson itself. He bonded deeply with Malak and others, yet carried within him an independence that set him apart, as though even among the Jedi he remained slightly alone. In the quiet halls of the temple, when night fell and the galaxy's traffic glittered outside the windows, he would sit with the old texts spread before him, eyes tracing words that hinted at truths older than the Order itself. And in those hours, one could almost imagine the Force leaning closer, whispering not as a teacher but as a conspirator, as if it too was curious what this boy might become. From the beginning, Revan was more than a student. He was a question-given form, a challenge to the Order's orthodoxy, a flame that promised either illumination or destruction. And though no one could yet name what future awaited him, those who knew him as a child would later look back and say they had always felt it, that in the depths of his gaze, in the certainty of his voice, and in the restless hunger of his spirit, they glimpsed the truth. This boy was not born to follow. He was born to lead. He was not shaped by the galaxy. He would shape it. He was not merely a Jedi. He was Revan. Chapter 2. The Revanist movement and the Jedi Council's refusal to act. As Revan and Malak grew into their roles as Jedi Knights, the galaxy itself seemed to darken under the rising storm of the Mandalorian Wars, a conflict that began on the fringes but spread like wildfire until whole sectors of the Republic burned and countless innocents fell beneath the weight of conquest. The Mandalorians, driven by tradition and bloodlust, swept into the Outer Rim, enslaving, killing, and devastating worlds. And yet the Jedi Council, bound by their rigid interpretation of caution and fear of repeating ancient mistakes, chose to do nothing. To them, intervention was a dangerous path that might draw the Order into darkness. But to Revan, it was cowardice wrapped in philosophy, betrayal disguised as restraint. The boy who had once questioned the contradictions in the code now saw them writ large across the galaxy, where the very Order sworn to defend the helpless stood idle while children were enslaved, cities reduced to ash, and the Republic itself teetered on collapse. Revan's fury was not selfish ambition, but conviction, and his charisma began to gather others to his side. What began as conversations in temple corridors became debates that spilled into the public eye, until whispers of Revan's stance became shouts, and Jedi both young and old began to question the wisdom of the council. Malak stood with him unwaveringly, lending his loyalty to Revan's cause, and together they became the faces of a rising faction later known as the Revanists. To many within the Republic, Revan became a beacon of hope, the warrior who would do what the council would not, the leader who spoke for those who had no voice, and the press and public alike elevated him to the status of hero even before he set foot on the battlefield. He and his followers ventured into the war zones themselves, not as soldiers yet, but as witnesses, traveling to ravaged worlds and seeing firsthand the brutal reality of the Mandalorians' campaign. On KOTOR, Revan walked among the dead and the silence of a world extinguished, its entire people erased by Mandalorian cruelty, and when he unearthed the mask of a fallen warrior who had died defending the innocent, he claimed it, not as a trophy, but as a vow, swearing he would never remove it until justice had been delivered. That mask became more than a relic. It became a symbol of defiance, an image that rallied the oppressed and gave shape to a movement. When Revan returned to Coruscant and laid his findings before the council, pleading for action, they still refused, their words draped in calm rationality, but their silence screaming of fear. Revan's frustration burned hotter with each denial, and he began to realize that the council's path would doom the Republic, that perhaps the only way forward was to lead without their blessing. Slowly but surely, his movement gained momentum, growing from murmurs of dissent into a tidal wave of support, with Jedi soldiers and citizens alike declaring loyalty to his cause. The Republic Senate looked to him with admiration, military leaders deferred to his insight, and for many it seemed as though the Jedi Council was becoming irrelevant in the face of his resolve. Revan's words carried the conviction of destiny, and those who heard him speak often claimed that it was not merely a man, but the Force itself that seemed to be speaking through him. Thus, the Revanist movement was born not out of rebellion, but out of necessity, a response to a galaxy left bleeding by inaction, and though the Council still muttered about danger, about the seduction of war, their influence began to wane as Revan's star rose. The boy who had once been a curious Padawan had now become something greater, a leader, a symbol, a figure whose mask and words carried the weight of entire systems, and though the Council could not see it yet, the galaxy had already chosen to follow him, for when the choice lay between silence and salvation, between philosophy and survival, the people chose Revan. Chapter 3. Origin of the Mask. By the year 3963. Before the Battle of Yavin, Revan was no longer just a rebellious voice within the Jedi Order, but a figure whose very name carried weight across the Republic, a warrior philosopher whose defiance had transformed into a movement that refused to fade, and though the Council still sought to rein him in, the galaxy itself had already begun to look to him as a savior. It was during this time, in the aftermath of endless skirmishes and pleas for Jedi intervention, that Revan's path intersected with the shattered world of KOTOR, a planet whose silence screamed louder than any Senate chamber or council debate. The world was dead, stripped of life, its surface covered in the whispers of a massacre so profound that the air itself seemed to mourn. Revan had been led there by fellow Jedi who believed the truth of the Mandalorian's crimes might finally rattle the Council from its paralysis, but what he discovered was more than evidence of atrocity. It was destiny itself reaching from the sands. On KOTOR, as the waves lapped against a shore that had once run red with blood, Revan felt the Force seize him and pull him into a vision, and not just him, but also Alec, who had by now begun calling himself Malak, as well as the Jedi Masters who had accompanied them in hopes of disbanding his growing movement. They saw the past unfold like a nightmare brought to life. KOTOR civilians, unarmed and terrified, being herded into the sea by armored Mandalorians under the ruthless command of Cassius Fett, their cries echoing across the beach even as their lives were extinguished. The Jedi ignited their lightsabers instinctively, but the vision was untouchable. Only memory, and they could do nothing but watch. Among the slaughter stood one Mandalorian warrior who dared defy the Order, who begged Fett to show mercy, insisting that the KOTOR were already defeated and posed no threat. Fett's reply was cold and unyielding. Dishonor had to be erased, and mercy had no place among Mandalorians. The rebel Mandalorian chose to die alongside the KOTOR, and when the sea claimed his body, his mask was lost to time, until that moment when Revan uncovered it, buried beneath the sands. As the vision faded and silence fell upon the witnesses, Revan held the mask in his hands, and something shifted within him, something as inexorable as gravity. He placed it over his face, not in triumph, but in oath, swearing that he would never remove it until justice had been done, until the Mandalorians had been defeated, until the Republic and its innocents were safe once more. In that vow, the mask ceased to be merely a piece of armor. It became the embodiment of his cause, the image by which billions would know him, the symbol that rallied soldiers, Jedi, and civilians alike. For those who saw him that day, Revan ceased to be just a man. He became an idea, the living incarnation of the Republic's will to resist. The Council, shaken by the undeniable truth of the vision, could no longer wholly ignore him, though they still balked at granting their blessing. They attempted compromise, allowing Revan's followers to serve the Republic not as Jedi, but as a kind of auxiliary force, humanitarian in name, though martial in practice, a thin veil over the reality that these Revanists were now a sanctioned army under his command. Revan accepted the compromise, not out of obedience, but because it gave him what he needed: legitimacy, resources, and the authority to fight the war the Council would not. And so, the mask he had claimed on KOTOR became the face of a crusade, a reminder not only of Mandalorian cruelty, but of the promise that such cruelty would be answered. And as the Republic soldiers began to march under his command, the image of the masked Jedi at their head spread like wildfire across the stars. Revan was no longer a mere knight defying his elders. He had become something much larger, a legend in the making, and though the Council still muttered warnings of the dark path he walked, the galaxy no longer listened. They listened to the man in the mask. Chapter 4: The Mandalorian Wars. In the weeks that followed his vow on KOTOR, Revan and his followers cast aside hesitation and hurled themselves into the war that the Jedi Council still refused to claim, becoming not mere advisors, but warriors leading from the front lines, their lightsabers igniting in the heart of battles where the fate of the Republic was written in fire and blood, and for every world that burned under Mandalorian conquest, Revan answered with strategy, brilliance, and an iron resolve that made him both feared and revered. Among his ranks, one name began to rise: Meetra Surik, who would later be known as the Jedi Exile, whose loyalty, insight, and ruthlessness in war made her indispensable, a lieutenant whose presence reflected the trust Revan inspired in those who fought at his side. Revan's campaigns quickly distinguished themselves for their effectiveness. Where Republic generals faltered, he prevailed, and at Duro in 3962 BBY, he and Malak saved the Republic from what could have been annihilation, his tactics turning what looked like defeat into a decisive victory that rippled across the galaxy. The Senate, desperate for salvation, elevated him to Supreme Commander, handing him authority over a third of the Republic's military, an act without precedent, but one embraced with relief. For while the Council hesitated, Revan delivered results. Yet the longer he fought, the more his strategies shifted, hardened, and darkened. At first he was the savior, the shining knight who stood between civilization and slaughter, but war corrodes even the brightest ideals, and as months bled into years, the cost of victory began to twist his choices. Civilian lives, moral restraint, even entire worlds became pawns in his calculations, sacrifices weighed and justified in the name of ultimate victory. If one world burned so that 5 might be saved, then burn it he would, and if brutality ended a campaign swiftly, then brutality was no longer a crime, but a necessity. Slowly, the line between Jedi and Mandalorian blurred, for Revan had come to believe that fighting an enemy steeped in ruthlessness demanded ruthlessness in return. And yet it was not only on the battlefield that his transformation deepened. In his relentless pursuit of victory, he unearthed secrets of the galaxy's ancient past, as though fate itself was guiding him toward a darker destiny. On Dantooine, he uncovered a Rakatan temple and the fragments of a star map that hinted at a weapon of unimaginable power. On Kashyyyk, in the depths of the Shadowlands, he found another piece of the same puzzle. And on Malachor Thieve, steeped in the poisonous energies of the dark side, he discovered the Treyas Academy, a Sith stronghold of ancient knowledge. In its shadows, Revan's hunger for understanding found a new source to feed upon, and though he still fought under the banner of the Republic, the whispers of the Sith began to weave themselves into his mind. He shared these secrets with Malak, and together they began to absorb the teachings, blending Jedi discipline with Sith ruthlessness, transforming themselves into something neither side could fully recognize. The war dragged on, culminating in the crucible of Malachor V, where Revan devised a plan that would end the Mandalorians once and for all. There, Meetra Surik was tasked with activating the mass shadow generator, a weapon capable of tearing apart gravity itself. The trap was set. Republic fleets clashed with Mandalorian armadas above the shattered world, and as Mandalore the Ultimate himself stepped forward to challenge Revan in single combat, tradition demanded that only the strongest warrior could rule. Their duel was fierce, a clash of raw strength against honed brilliance, but Revan triumphed, striking down the Mandalorian leader. In his final moments, Mandalore revealed a shocking truth, that the war itself had been seeded by a Sith, a red-skinned figure who had lured him into awakening an ancient tomb, twisting Mandalorian honor into a weapon for darker designs. With his dying breath, he gave Revan the coordinates to Rekiad, proof of his manipulation. Yet before that secret could be fully unraveled, the shadow generator was activated. From orbit, Revan watched as the weapon ignited, crushing fleets, ships, and soldiers alike, tearing the crust of Malachor asunder until the world itself screamed in agony. Billions died in moments, their voices extinguished as though the galaxy itself had been wounded, and though the Republic emerged victorious, the price was so catastrophic that victory felt indistinguishable from massacre. The Mandalorians were shattered, their droids dismantled, their warriors stripped of honor, their leader's mask taken as both trophy and symbol. But in the silence that followed, something within Revan had broken as well. He had fulfilled his vow, but the cost was beyond anything a Jedi should ever have endured, and though the Republic celebrated, the Jedi Council recoiled, for in the man who returned to them, they no longer saw a prodigy or a savior, but a leader who had looked into the abyss and begun to embrace its power. Chapter 5. The Jedi Civil War begins. The galaxy had barely recovered from the devastation of the Mandalorian Wars when the thunder of war returned, this time carried on the black sails of Darth Revan's Sith fleet, a force unlike any the Republic had ever faced, for it was not only vast in number, but born of the Star Forge, that ancient Rakatan machine orbiting the Lehan system which consumed the power of a star and bent it into endless legions of ships and weapons, feeding Revan's empire at a pace no natural industry could rival. And when he moved against the Republic, his strikes were precise, devastating, and terrifying in their efficiency. His first blow fell upon the shipyards at Foyorost, the beating heart of the Republic Navy, where Revan, armed with knowledge of every defense and weakness he had once commanded as Supreme Commander, unleashed a strike that shattered the Republic's ability to replenish its fleets, and in the chaos that followed, he elevated Saul Karath, once a decorated Republic admiral who had betrayed his oath, to command the Sith forces, his treachery marking the beginning of the Republic's slow spiral into desperation. World after world fell as Revan advanced across the Outer Rim, his fleet swelling with captured ships and defectors drawn by the promise of power and stability under his rule. And on each world he conquered, he sought not only to crush, but to convert, sparing Jedi who surrendered and twisting them into Sith, while those who resisted were slaughtered, their bodies left as warnings to all who would defy the new order. Yet even as he spread his dominion, Revan's vision remained more complex than destruction, for unlike Malak, whose lust for carnage grew unchecked, Revan's purpose was to forge the galaxy into something that could endure the true storm he knew still waited in the unknown regions, the immortal Sith Emperor, whose existence had first been revealed to him on Nathema and whose shadow still haunted him. To this end, Revan's cruelty was measured, his conquest tempered by strategy, for he did not wish to annihilate the Republic, but to break it, remake it, and weld it into something stronger. But Malak was not satisfied to wait in the shadow of his master's vision. His envy burned like acid, and his cruelty spilled unchecked, leading him to order the orbital bombardment of Telos IV, a world Revan had intended to capture intact, leaving it a wasteland of ash and ruin, and sowing the seeds of tension between master and apprentice. Their partnership, once a bond forged in shared defiance of the Jedi Council, had begun to rot, and though Malak still knelt, his ambition sharpened with every passing battle. Still, together they were nearly unstoppable. The Jedi, too few and too fractured after their losses in the Mandalorian Wars, found themselves hunted, their temples desecrated, their students lured away or slain. For the first time since the ancient wars of old, the galaxy trembled before a Sith Empire rising in full power, and at its helm was a man whose mask had become a nightmare, the symbol of a savior who had once fought for the Republic, but now returned as its executioner. Revan, prodigal knight, commander, conqueror, and now Dark Lord, had begun the war that would come to be known as the Jedi Civil War, a conflict that would test the very soul of the Republic and unravel the fragile threads of the Jedi Order. And in its opening act, the galaxy learned a terrible truth, that its greatest hero had become its greatest enemy. Chapter 6: Betrayal and the Fall of Darth Revan. At the height of his power, when entire sectors bent beneath his will and the Starforge vomited forth endless fleets to swell his empire, Darth Revan appeared invincible, a masked shadow whose strategies confounded every attempt at resistance, yet in truth the seeds of his downfall had already begun to sprout, for within the heart of his own empire the most dangerous enemy he faced was not the Jedi or the Republic, but his own apprentice, Darth Malak, whose hunger for power and impatience with Revan's grand design grew more poisonous with each passing campaign. The rift between them, once brothers bound by loyalty and shared vision, widened as Malak's brutality clashed with Revan's careful calculations, and the tension reached its breaking point after the atrocity at Telos 4, where Malak ordered the world's destruction in defiance of Revan's intent to preserve it for the future strength of the Sith Empire. Though Revan chastised him and struck him down in their confrontation, severing his jaw and leaving him scarred and forced to wear a cybernetic prosthesis, Malak survived, and with his life preserved, his resentment festered. He began to plot in shadows, outwardly serving while secretly hungering for the moment he could eclipse his master. That moment came when the Republic, desperate and bleeding, devised a desperate gambit, a trap laid with fleets in the Outer Rim, bait to lure Revan into battle so that a Jedi strike team led by Bastila Shan, a young knight gifted with the rare art of battle meditation, could board his flagship and end the war at its heart. Revan, ever the tactician, accepted the challenge, confident in his ability to break yet another Republic trick, but as his flagship reeled under fire and Bastila and her team fought their way to him, Malak seized his chance. From the bridge of his own ship, he ordered a barrage upon his master's vessel, hoping to kill Revan outright along with the Jedi intruders, and in one stroke rid himself of his rival and claim the mantle of Dark Lord. The assault tore through the flagship, explosions gutting its hull, fire and steel collapsing in upon itself. In the chaos, Revan confronted Bastila, his blade clashing against hers in a duel interrupted by the thunder of Malak's betrayal, and in that fateful moment she struck him with the Force, casting him down even as the ship was consumed around him. Bastila, standing over the fallen Sith Lord, felt the weight of a decision that would alter the galaxy. To kill him was to extinguish the greatest threat the Republic had ever faced, yet in her heart and through the force bond formed in the crucible of battle, she sensed something more, a spark that whispered of redemption. Against the teachings of the Order and the urging of her companions, she sustained his broken body with the Force and carried him from the wreckage. To the galaxy, it seemed Revan had perished, his empire left in the hands of Malak, who wasted no time in declaring himself the new Dark Lord of the Sith, reveling in the bloodshed and destruction that his master had once tempered. Yet in truth, Revan lived, though not as he once had, for the Jedi Council, wary and calculating, took the broken man Bastila delivered to them and erased his memories, stripping him of his identity, his crimes, and his power, leaving only an empty shell they hoped could be remade. In the silence of their chambers, they chose not to execute, but to gamble, believing that perhaps through this hollow vessel they might find the key to defeating Malak, for the bond between Bastila and Revan was strong, forged in fire and in blood, and the council hoped it could guide him back to the light. And so the man who had once been the galaxy's greatest warrior awoke without past, without mask, without name, cast into the Republic as nothing more than a soldier, his destiny rewritten, while in the shadows Malak tightened his grip, his laughter echoing across burning worlds as the Republic faced a Sith Lord even crueler than the Master who had come before. The betrayal was complete, and with it, the galaxy spun into an even deeper abyss. Chapter 7: The Search for the Star Maps. From the moment Revan set foot upon the ancient ruins of Dantooine, where the stone walls of Rakatan architecture whispered secrets older than the Republic itself, his path was no longer merely survival, but destiny. For as Bastila guided him into the depths of the Enclave, and the Council spoke of visions and bonds, the Force began to stir in him with a resonance that could not be dismissed. And within those crumbling chambers, he and Bastila shared a vision of the past, of himself and Malak uncovering the truth of the star maps during the Mandalorian Wars, a revelation that shook him though he could not yet name why. The Council, cloaking their true intent in riddles, tasked him with retracing these steps, sending him and his companions on a journey across the galaxy to piece together the fragments that pointed to the Starforge, believing that in this quest, his identity might return, or else his destiny might be rewritten. Thus began the Odyssey aboard the Ebenhawk, with Bastila ever at his side, Karth's wary eyes upon him, Mission's youthful optimism, Zolbar's gruff loyalty, Canderous' Mandalorian pragmatism, and the droids T3M4 and HK-47 joining to form a crew as unlikely as it was essential, bound together by fate more than choice. Their first destination was Tatooine, a world of burning sands and endless horizons where Tusken raiders prowled and legends of the Krayt Dragon lingered in the whispers of desert winds. It was here that Revan uncovered the second star map, hidden within the lair of a great Krayt Dragon, its body bloated and twisted by the dark energy radiating from the ancient artifact, and in slaying the beast with cunning traps and explosives, he not only freed captives, but also touched once more upon the echoes of his forgotten past. On Kashyyyk, deep beneath the canopy in the Wookiee Shadowlands, he confronted the corruption of Chirka slavers and reunited Zalbar with his disgraced father and treacherous brother, navigating the tangled loyalties of family even as he unearthed another map beneath the roots of the forest, the ancient device glowing with the same dark energy that seemed to call to him from beyond memory. On Manaan, amid the ocean depths and the fragile neutrality of the Selkath, he uncovered Sith schemes to manipulate the youth of the species and destabilize the delicate balance upon which both Republic and Sith relied for the precious resource of KOTOR. And in the murky waters, where shadows moved among the ruins of the Rakata, he discovered yet another map, each piece drawing him inexorably closer to the Forge. Finally, upon Korriban, the cradle of Sith history, Revan walked once more in halls he had known in another life, infiltrating the academy disguised as a hopeful acolyte, and as he descended into the tombs of Naga Sadoth and Ajunta Pol, ancient lords whose whispers still clung to the air, he found not only the final map but the echo of himself, the Dark Lord, whose hand had once disturbed those same graves. All the while, Bastila remained close, her bond with him tightening like an unspoken promise, her heart caught between duty and a connection she could not fully deny, while Karth's suspicion deepened as he began to sense that the man he followed carried secrets darker than any soldier should. Yet even with their doubts, the crew rallied behind him, for in battle after battle, in negotiation after negotiation, Revan's leadership revealed itself, not as a mask, but as an intrinsic truth. And though he did not know his own name, others began to see in him the qualities of a hero, a leader who drew the best from those around him. With each map recovered, the vision of the Forge grew clearer, until at last the coordinates pointed toward the ancient world of Lehon. But before the journey could be completed, fate intervened in the form of Admiral Saul Karath, whose flagship Leviathan dragged the Ebon Hawk from hyperspace with a gravity well projector, capturing them all. There, in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, tortured and mocked, Revan would face a revelation that would shatter the fragile identity he had been given, a truth spoken not by allies, but by his greatest enemy, and the man who had once been reborn as a soldier of the Republic would finally be forced to confront who he truly was. Chapter 8. The revelation of Darth Revan's identity aboard the Leviathan. The capture of the Ebon Hawk by Admiral Saul Karath and his mighty flagship the Leviathan was not merely another trial in a long chain of battles, but the crucible where truth, long concealed, would erupt in a way that no companion, no Jedi, and not even Revan himself could escape. For in the steel corridors of that warship, under the shadow of torture chambers and interrogation droids, the fragile mask of his false identity began to crack. Karath, once a proud Republic admiral and Karth Onasi's trusted superior, now stood as a traitor draped in Sith authority, his voice dripping with malice as he reveled in the capture of those who had plagued him, and he wasted no opportunity to remind Karth of the betrayal at Telos IV, twisting the knife of grief that had never healed. Bastila, Revan, and Karth were shackled, questioned, and broken apart into pieces meant to be discarded. Yet Revan, though stripped of memory, fought with an instinct that startled even his captors, and when at last escape seemed possible, aided by the cunning of their companions who infiltrated the detention blocks, they pressed forward only to confront Karath himself on the command deck. Their duel was not merely physical, but personal, for Karth's rage and sorrow boiled over as he demanded justice for Telos, and though Karath fell, his dying words cut deeper than any blade, for he gasped out the truth Revan did not yet understand, that the man Karth had trusted, the man who had led their mission, was none other than the Dark Lord himself. Karth reeled, disbelief colliding with fury, and turned upon Bastila, demanding answers, for she had known all along. Before she could speak, the air shifted with the arrival of Darth Malak, towering and cruel, his metallic jaw gleaming as he stepped forward to mock his former master. Malak's laughter filled the chamber as he revealed what none could deny, that the man who now fought for the Republic, who stood as Bastila's bondmate and Karth's comrade, was the very architect of the Sith War, the Dark Lord whose name had been cursed across the stars. He spoke of betrayal, of the Council's cowardice, of the memory wipe that had been inflicted upon Revan, and in that moment, the fragile scaffolding of identity collapsed. Revan, stunned, searched within himself for denial, but the visions that had haunted him since the beginning, the fragments of battles and the mask staring back through the fog of dreams, suddenly aligned, and the truth was undeniable. He was Revan. Bastila admitted the truth with trembling words, confessing that she had saved him, sustained him, and bound herself to him through the Force, and that the Council had sought to reshape him not into a prisoner, but into a weapon, hoping to turn his former darkness into the Republic's salvation. Rage, betrayal, sorrow, all surged in Karth, who could not reconcile the man he had fought beside with the monster who had once commanded the Sith fleets. Revan himself stood broken between two worlds, no longer able to believe in the lie of anonymity, yet not ready to embrace the full darkness of what he had been. Malak, savoring the chaos, sought to end the matter himself, igniting his saber and unleashing his fury upon his master, mocking him for his weakness and delighting in the irony that the Jedi had turned their greatest enemy into a puppet. Bastila, sensing the inevitability, intervened, throwing herself against Malak to buy Revan and Karth time to escape, sealing the blast doors behind her even as Revan shouted her name in desperation. The ship trembled as the battle raged around them, the escape frantic and desperate, but none of it could erase the weight of what had been revealed. When at last the Ebon Hawk broke free of the Leviathan and the companions regrouped, the truth hung over them like a shadow. Karth could barely look at him. Mission and Zalbar struggled with disbelief. Canderous almost reveled in the revelation, proud to follow the galaxy's greatest warrior, and HK-47, with a flicker of mechanical glee, revealed that his programming had always recognized Revan as his true master. Jolie Bindo, ever the cynic, merely shrugged, claiming he had known all along, while Bastila's absence cut more deeply than any accusation. Alone among them, Revan bore the weight of the revelation, knowing now that the mask he had once donned on Cathar had never truly left him, and though the Council had sought to erase his sins, they could not erase the truth of his soul. He was Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, once destroyer of worlds, now cast adrift in a battle for his own redemption, and as the Leviathan receded into hyperspace behind them, the galaxy held its breath. For the war was no longer just between Republic and Sith, it was within the heart of the man, who had once commanded both. Chapter 9. The Fall of Bastila, Shan and Revan's path to confront Malak. The revelation aboard the Leviathan was a wound that did not close, for though Revan escaped with his companions, and the truth of his past now burned within him like a fire that could not be smothered, The cost of that escape was Bastila herself, captured by Malak and carried into the abyss of the Sith, where torture and temptation awaited her. In the days that followed, the Ebon Hawk drifted not only through hyperspace but through the fragile silence of a crew torn by revelation, each companion grappling with what it meant to serve alongside the man who had once been the Republic's greatest enemy. And though some recoiled in distrust, others found in him the same leader they had already chosen to follow, a man whose choices in the present mattered more than the mask of his past. Mission still looked upon him as the friend who had saved her brother. Zalbar grumbled his agreement through the Wookiee life debt that bound him. Canderous saw only the warrior worthy of respect, and Jolie Bindo, with the weary wisdom of one who had walked the fringes of the Order, reminded all that redemption was as real a path as damnation. Yet Cartho Nasi struggled the most, his grief for Telos and hatred for Saul Kareth now colliding with the betrayal of having trusted Revan unknowing. And though his loyalty to the Republic remained unshaken, his heart wavered whenever he looked into the eyes of the man who had once orchestrated its near destruction. But amid this storm, Revan himself grew steadier, as if the truth, though painful, had forged clarity, and with each passing day his bond with the Force deepened, no longer chained by lies or ignorance, but open, raw, and whole. His visions sharpened, his instincts guided the crew toward the final fragments of the star maps, and slowly the path to the Star Forge revealed itself, a trail of fire and memory leading them inexorably toward destiny. Yet destiny was not without cruelty, for while Revan sought to gather his strength and prepare for the final confrontation with Malak, the shadow of Bastila loomed across every choice. In Malak's hands, she was more than a prisoner. She was the perfect instrument to wound Revan, for their force bond made her the one thread that could unravel him. Malak tormented her, broke her, and whispered that her power of battle meditation, if given freely to him, could tip the balance of the war forever. She resisted as long as she could, but Malak was cunning, and pain, fear, and doubt eroded the walls she had built until at last the darkness seeped in and twisted her heart. When Revan finally stood before her again, it was not the steadfast Jedi Knight he had once known, but a Sith apprentice, her lightsaber burning red, her voice sharpened with scorn as she mocked his weakness and declared that she had chosen Malak, that she had abandoned the bonds of light to embrace the strength of the dark side. The duel between them was not only of blades but of hearts, for Revan fought not to kill her but to call her back, his voice echoing with the memory of every hardship they had endured together, every secret shared, every unspoken thread of affection that bound them. Through the Force bond, he reached for her, pleading not as a commander to a subordinate, but as a man to the woman who had saved him, sustained him, and believed in him even when she had not wanted to. Bastila, torn between rage and longing, faltered beneath his words, but her fear of weakness, her shame at having been broken, hardened her resolve, and she fled rather than yield, leaving Revan once more with the ache of loss. Yet her betrayal did not crush him. It steeled him, for in that moment he understood fully what Malak had become, the depth of cruelty and corruption that now defined his former apprentice, and he knew the final confrontation could no longer be delayed. The maps were complete, the location of the Star Forge revealed, and the Republic fleet, battered and desperate, looked to him as their only hope. The Jedi Council, though uneasy with the truth of who he was, could no longer deny that he alone had the power to stand against Malak, and the companions aboard the Ebon Hawk, despite doubts and fears, pledged themselves to his cause. And so Revan, once a prodigal knight, once a dark lord, once a broken shell, now stood as something else entirely. A man who carried the full weight of his past but refused to be defined by it. A man who would stride into the heart of the Forge not as puppet of the Council or pawn of the Sith, but as Revan, unmasked in truth if not in face, and ready to face his former apprentice in a battle that would decide not only the fate of the war, but the legacy of his soul. Chapter 10. The Battle of the Star Forge. The journey to the Star Forge was not a mere voyage across hyperspace, but a passage into legend, for as the Ebon Hawk emerged above the ancient world of Leron, its crew beheld not only the wreckage of long-dead ships scattered like bones across the void, but the monstrous silhouette of the Forge itself, a space station so vast it dwarfed the fleets gathered to contest it, its surface alive with conduits of energy siphoned from the star it orbited, its heart pulsing with the dark side like a wound in the Force. Revan had been here before, though the memory came to him in fragments, a haunting familiarity that spoke of oaths broken and choices made, and as he gazed upon the forge, he knew it was more than a factory of war. It was a living machine, a parasite that had devoured the Rakatan Infinite Empire and now threatened to consume the galaxy again through Malak's command. The Republic fleet, summoned by Bastila's battle meditation after her redemption at Revan's hand, surged into battle against the Sith Armada, and the void became a storm of turbolasers, starfighters, and fire that lit the darkness like an endless sunrise of destruction. Yet the true battle would not be fought among the fleets, but within the forge itself, where Malak awaited, his power magnified by the station's hunger, his cruelty sharpened by the endless suffering he had inflicted upon captured Jedi. Revan led his companions through the choking corridors of the forge, where droids poured forth in endless waves, forged and spat out by the station's twisted factories, and where the air itself seemed heavy with malice. One by one, his allies split away, each taking a stand to hold back the tide so that he might press forward, their loyalty a reminder that he was no longer alone as he had been in the days of his rise and fall. At last, he reached the command chamber, where Malak stood upon a platform encircled by stasis fields containing Jedi, whose life essence he had bound to the forge, their suffering fueling his strength. Malak's laughter echoed through the chamber as he mocked his former master, declaring that Revan's attempt at redemption was weakness, that true power was only in domination, and that he, not Revan, would be remembered as the galaxy's Dark Lord. Their blades ignited, red against violet, and the clash that followed was the culmination of years of war, of betrayal, of friendship twisted into rivalry. Malak drew upon the bound Jedi, siphoning their life through the forge to replenish his strength each time Revan struck him down, his voice dripping with cruelty as he reveled in their agony. But Revan, steady and resolute, destroyed the life support capsules one by one, freeing the Jedi even as Malak raged, cutting off the source of his stolen vitality until at last he was forced to stand upon his own merit. The duel raged across platforms and catwalks, each strike a thunderclap of destiny, each parry a test of will, until at last Revan's blade pierced Malak, driving him to his knees. Gasping, broken, Malak looked up into the maskless face of the man he had once called brother, and in that final moment, the weight of his choices bore down upon him. He whispered a question, half in bitterness, half in sorrow, wondering aloud what his life might have been had the Jedi captured him instead of Revan, whether he might have found redemption, whether he had been doomed not by fate but by his own decisions. Revan, kneeling beside him, spoke not with triumph but with sorrow, reminding Malak that though manipulation and circumstance had shaped their paths, choice had always been theirs to make, and that his downfall was not inevitable but chosen. Malak, with the last of his strength, admitted that perhaps it had always been Revan's destiny to carry the galaxy, that he had been only a shadow cast by his master's light, and with those words he died, leaving silence where once his ambition had thundered. As Malak's body fell still, the Starforge shuddered, the bond between Dark Lord and station severed, and above, the Republic fleet pressed the advantage Bastila provided, breaking the Sith line and turning the tide of war. Revan returned to the Ebonhawk, where Bastila and Karth awaited, their relief tempered by the knowledge that the forge itself must be destroyed, and together they fled into the void as the Republic ships rained fire upon the colossal station. Turbolasers tore into its structure, flames consumed its conduits, and the forge, that ancient machine of endless war, collapsed upon itself and died in a storm of fire, its fall marking the end of the Jedi Civil War. On Lehon's surface, before cheering soldiers and solemn Jedi, Admiral Dodonna awarded Revan and his companions the Cross of Glory, while Master Vander declared Revan the prodigal knight, redeemed and restored to the Order, his journey from Savior to Sith and back again sealed in legend. Yet even as the crowd cheered and the sky above filled with ceremonial flyovers, Revan's thoughts were not upon triumph, but upon the silence in the force that still lingered from beyond the unknown regions, the whisper of an emperor whose shadow had first drawn him into darkness and who still waited, watching, beyond the veil of the known galaxy. The war was over, but the true battle was yet to come. Chapter 11, The Aftermath and Revan's Uneasy Redemption. The destruction of the Starforge and the fall of Darth Malak marked the end of the Jedi Civil War. Yet for Revan, victory brought no true peace. For though the Republic celebrated its survival, and the Jedi Council cautiously welcomed him back into the fold, the weight of what he had been and what he had done hung over him like a shadow that could not be lifted. He returned to Coruscant, not as the Dark Lord, but as the Prodigal Knight, the title bestowed by Master Vander, carrying both acknowledgement of his redemption and a reminder of his fall. And though the Council awarded him recognition and the Republic heaped honors upon him, their trust was strained, their eyes wary, for they could not forget that it was he who had once unleashed the Sith upon the galaxy. Bastila, ever bound to him through their bond, remained at his side, and in her presence he found a fragile serenity, a love that had blossomed despite the Jedi Code, and a connection that reminded him that the light was not merely restraint but compassion, that strength could come from loyalty, affection, and even passion. They married in quiet defiance of the order, and though whispers of disapproval moved among the council, Revan no longer sought their approval, for his faith was not in their rigid doctrines but in the truth he had lived, that the Force was not to be divided into absolutes but embraced in its fullness, light and dark alike, shaping those who walked its path. Yet as days turned into months and he settled into life upon Coruscant, the past refused to rest. Dreams haunted him, visions of shadowed worlds and voices calling from the abyss of the unknown regions, visions that clawed at the edge of his mind until sleep became torment. In these nightmares, he felt the pull of a power older and darker than Malak, a presence that reminded him of Nathema, of the Emperor whose existence he had uncovered before his fall. He tried to ignore them, tried to live in peace beside Bastila, especially when she revealed she carried their child, a son whose life filled him with hope he had thought forever lost. But even then, the shadow did not fade. Carfonasi, who had slowly reconciled with the man he once despised, noticed the distance in Revan's eyes, the way his thoughts drifted beyond the galactic core as though something called to him. Canderous Ordo, now Mandalore the Preserver, spoke with him of honor and the need for vigilance, for he too sensed that the Mandalorian Wars had been only a prelude to something greater. Revan confided in few, yet the truth gnawed at him. The Emperor still lived, and though the Republic celebrated its fragile peace, he knew it was but the eye of the storm. In the archives he searched for traces of Mitra Surik, the exile who had once followed him and vanished into silence after Malachor, believing that perhaps she too had sensed the shadow and walked her own path to face it, but he found nothing but whispers of exile and rumor. Alone with his doubts, Revan began to understand that his redemption was incomplete, for though he had defeated Malak and destroyed the Forge, he had not destroyed the source of the darkness that had set the galaxy aflame. The Council wanted him to remain, to serve as a symbol of penance and discipline, but Revan was never one to be contained, and as the visions grew sharper, as the pull of the unknown regions became unbearable, he made his choice. He kissed Bastila goodbye, his hand lingering upon her swelling belly, promising her that his journey was for their child's future, that he would confront the darkness not for himself, but for the galaxy their son would inherit. She wept, pleaded, and raged against his decision, but in the end she knew she could not stop him, for the man she loved was also the man the galaxy demanded. And so Revan departed once more, leaving behind his family, his friends, and the Republic he had saved, vanishing into the unknown regions with only T3-M4 at his side, determined to face the Emperor whose shadow had haunted his every step. The Republic rejoiced in peace, the Jedi believed the threat ended, but Revan knew better, and as his ship slipped beyond the stars into the darkness, the galaxy's greatest hero and greatest villain became once more a wanderer, a seeker of truths, a man whose destiny remained unfinished and whose story was far from over. Chapter 12. Into the Unknown Regions. The stars of the known galaxy faded behind him as Revan's ship pierced into the uncharted void, a place few dared to tread and fewer still returned from, for the unknown regions were a graveyard of civilizations and secrets, filled with anomalies that bent navigation, maelstroms of gravity that swallowed fleets, and whispers of ancient powers whose shadows reached across millennia. For Revan, it was not curiosity that drew him into this abyss, but compulsion, a relentless summons carried through the Force, the echo of the Emperor's presence pulling him ever onward. He travelled not as a Sith seeking conquest, nor as a Jedi seeking enlightenment, but as a man driven by necessity, knowing that the fragile peace he had bought with the destruction of the Starforge was nothing more than a pause before a far greater storm. His only companion was T-3-M4, the loyal astromech who chirped and whirred in the silence of the ship's corridors, a reminder of his past journeys and the allies he had left behind, and together they braved the silence of space that seemed heavier here, as though the Force itself thinned and warped the deeper they travelled. Worlds unknown to the Republic unfolded before him, desolate planets scarred by cataclysms long past, verdant spheres hiding ruins that whispered of species extinct before the first Jedi had ever ignited a lightsaber, and barren rocks whose surfaces bore markings that resonated with the dark side in ways that chilled even Revan's seasoned heart. He mapped what he could, but his true purpose remained fixed. Dromund Kaas, the hidden capital of the Sith Empire, the world he had glimpsed in fractured memory, the seat of the Emperor whose will had bent him once before. The journey was long and perilous, filled with trials that tested more than his skill with a blade. At times his mind faltered beneath the weight of silence, his dreams consumed by the face of Bastila and the unborn child he had left behind. And in those moments he questioned the price of his choice, the cruelty of abandoning love for destiny. Yet each time he faltered, the shadow of the Emperor loomed larger and Revan's resolve hardened, for he knew that if he did not walk this path, no one else could. When at last the mists of hyperspace broke and the dark world of Dromund Kaas filled his viewport, lightning tearing endlessly across its skies and jungles sprawling like veins of a living beast, Revan felt the Force shudder, as though he had stepped into the very heart of corruption. He descended into the storm, knowing that this was not merely another world, not merely another enemy to be faced, but the very root of the darkness that had shaped his life, the source of the Mandalorian Wars, the hand that had twisted his fall into the Sith and now threatened to consume the Republic entire. Here, in the bowels of the Sith Empire, his story would reach another crucible, one from which even he might not return. Chapter 13. Confrontation with the Emperor. The jungles of Dromund Kaas closed around him like the grip of a predator, their shadows alive with beasts twisted by the dark side, lightning raking endlessly across a sky that never knew peace. And as Revan pressed deeper into the heart of the world, he felt the weight of a presence that was not merely within the Force, but beyond it, a pressure that bent thought, memory, and will, as if the air itself conspired to break him. Guided by T-3-M4, who sifted through encrypted Sith transmissions and ancient data caches, Revan slipped past patrols and outposts, his every step drawing him closer to the Citadel where the Emperor reigned, a fortress carved from black stone and pulsing with energy that resonated like a wound in the Force. Within its walls, silence reigned more oppressive than any battlefield, for here even sound seemed afraid to linger. At the heart of this vast palace, in a chamber that stretched upward like the hollow throat of a beast, Revan at last beheld the Sith Emperor, known to his followers as Lord Vitiate, a figure cloaked in darkness so absolute that even the air seemed to warp around him. His eyes glowed like embers in a sea of shadow, his presence suffocating, not merely felt but inflicted, pressing against Revan's mind with the weight of eternity. For the Emperor was not a man in any ordinary sense. He was a predator who had consumed his own world, draining every living soul in a ritual that had left him immortal, his spirit so steeped in the dark side that it was difficult to separate where he ended and the corruption began. Revan ignited his blade, violet light flashing defiantly against the darkness, and for a moment he felt the old fire surge within him, the confidence of the general who had broken Mandalorians, who had bent the galaxy to his vision. But Vitiate's voice rolled forth like thunder across his mind, not spoken but imposed, a command that sought to unravel him from within. The Emperor did not raise a weapon at first, for his power needed no blade. His will lashed against Revan's like a storm, seeking to strip away thought, to unmake the very foundation of self, and Revan staggered beneath the assault, visions erupting in his mind of Bastila's face twisted by pain, of his child's cry swallowed by darkness, of fleets burning across the stars, all crafted to weaken his resolve. But Revan, who had endured capture, betrayal, and the torment of memory itself, pushed back, anchoring himself in the bond of love he carried with Bastila, in the belief that his sacrifice was not in vain. Their duel was not one of simple strikes, but of wills colliding, each moment a war across both body and spirit. When at last blades clashed, Revan realized the true horror of his opponent. The Emperor's strikes were not fueled by passion or rage as with other Sith, but by a void, an emptiness that consumed without feeling, an abyss that hungered for the annihilation of all life. Every blow Revan delivered was swallowed, every surge of the Force redirected against him, and though he fought with all the brilliance that had once made him invincible, it was as if he dueled not a man but the embodiment of entropy itself. In the end, his body gave way before his spirit did, his strength failing under the ceaseless tide of Vitiate's power, and he was cast down, broken upon the cold stone. Yet even in defeat, the Emperor did not kill him, for Vitiate saw in Revan something far more valuable than death. With his mastery of domination, he reached into Revan's mind, shackling his will, binding him with chains not of steel but of thought, and with cold precision he twisted him into a prisoner of his own mind, entombing him in stasis where he could be both preserved and exploited. Revan felt himself slipping into darkness, his last thoughts of Bastila and the child he would never see, and then there was silence. The Emperor had won, but in his arrogance he left a spark, for though Revan's body was imprisoned and his mind shackled, his spirit endured, waiting in the shadows for the moment when the galaxy would call upon him once more. Chapter 14. The Imprisonment of Revan. Deep within the throne world of Dromund Kaas, far below the citadel where storms tore eternally at the skies, Revan was sealed in darkness, entombed within a prison of thought and flesh, designed not merely to restrain, but to unravel, his body suspended in stasis fields, his mind chained by the Emperor's domination, every heartbeat a reminder that he no longer belonged to himself, but to the will of another. Years blurred into decades, decades into centuries, yet to Revan time became a strange and fractured thing, for though his body was preserved unnaturally, unaging within the Emperor's grasp, his mind wandered through visions and torment, caught between memories of what he had been and illusions crafted by his captor to break him. In some moments he was on KOTOR again, the mask slipping through his fingers. In others he relived the fire of Malak, the cries of the dead flooding his ears until he thought madness had claimed him. Yet in each trial he clung to fragments of truth, to the memory of Bastila's eyes, to the faint presence of the child he had left behind, and to the unwavering belief that even chains forged by the Emperor could not wholly extinguish the will of one who had already defied the galaxy's expectations. Vitiate returned to him often, not as a jailer, but as a shadow seeping into his mind, feeding upon his knowledge of Republic defenses, Jedi strategies, and the secrets of the Starforge, each interrogation, both theft and torment. Yet for all the Emperor's power, Revan learned to resist in silence, to twist his thoughts into knots that revealed nothing of what mattered most, to surrender fragments of truth in order to protect the core of himself, becoming not merely prisoner, but saboteur, a wedge within the Emperor's certainty that even the greatest mind could be broken. It was in this imprisonment that Revan's will became iron, for though his body could not move, his spirit stretched outward through the Force, tethered across the galaxy like a line cast into an endless ocean, and through that tether he whispered into dreams, stirring visions in those sensitive to the Force, planting seeds of resistance that would flower long after his name had faded into myth. In rare moments, when the Emperor's attention drifted elsewhere, Revan glimpsed clarity, sensing events unfolding beyond his prison, the rise and fall of worlds, the movement of fleets, the whispers of Jedi and Sith alike, and each vision strengthened his resolve, for he knew his captivity was not the end of his story, but a pause, a crucible in which his purpose was reforged. The centuries weighed upon him, each year pressing deeper into his soul, but where another might have surrendered to despair, Revan became paradoxically stronger, a figure both broken and unbreakable, his identity shattered yet sharpened, his will bent yet unyielding. He was no longer the savior of the Republic, nor the Dark Lord who had once ruled the Sith, but something else entirely, a prisoner whose chains became the proof of his endurance, a mind that endured when flesh should have perished, a legend waiting in the silence of eternity. In the depths of his imprisonment, the galaxy forgot his name, but the Force did not, and neither did he. For within his prison, Revan became more than man, more than Jedi, more than Sith. He became the embodiment of defiance itself, a flicker of light held within the darkest shadow, sustained by a single truth, that he was not finished, and that the galaxy had not yet seen the last of him. Chapter 15. The Emperor's Pawn. Though Revan's body remained bound within the Emperor's prison, his presence became woven into the very fabric of Vitiate's grand design, for the Dark Lord of the Sith saw in his captive not only a source of knowledge but a tool, a pawn to be twisted and used across centuries of manipulation. In the silence of the tomb-like chamber, Vitiate would descend upon him like a storm, probing his thoughts, siphoning his memories, pulling from him the secrets of war that had once shattered Mandalorians and nearly crushed the Republic. And in this harvesting of brilliance, the Emperor strengthened his own empire, reshaping the Sith military and its strategies with the genius that was not his own, but stolen from the mind he kept caged. Yet even as Vitiate sought to drain him, Revan learned to resist in ways subtle and defiant, planting deceptions and distortions within his own memories so that the Emperor's victories would carry hidden flaws, small cracks that in time could be exploited. In this eternal contest of wills, Revan became not only prisoner but saboteur, weakening his captor with poisoned truths that looked like wisdom. And though it seemed futile in the endless measure of years, it was enough to remind him that he still fought, that he still mattered. But Vitiate was patient beyond comprehension, and where brute force failed, he wove illusions around Revan, entire realities crafted to disorient and enslave. There were days, or what felt like days, when Revan believed he had been freed, walking again with Bastila, or holding the child he had left behind, only for the illusion to collapse into ash, a cruel reminder that the Emperor's power was absolute. There were other times when he was cast into endless battles within his mind, forced to relive Malachor, or his duel with Malak again and again, each defeat driving the Emperor's laughter deeper into his spirit. Yet for all this torment, Revan never fully broke, for within him burned a paradox the Emperor could not extinguish, the knowledge of both Jedi compassion and Sith determination, of light and dark mingled into something stronger than either alone. It was this paradox that kept him alive, and it was this paradox that made him dangerous, for in the Emperor's attempt to make him a pawn, he instead sharpened him into a blade. Still, the centuries pressed down upon him, and as time lost meaning, even Revan could not deny that part of himself began to fracture. His will split into pieces, one part bent toward resistance, another seduced by surrender, and in this division, the Emperor found his truest victory, for what better pawn than one whose soul was divided against itself? Yet through the cracks in his prison, Revan's influence seeped outward. Jedi meditated upon visions of a masked figure whispering warnings. Sith acolytes dreamed of a warrior who had once been both master and betrayer. The Force carried fragments of him into the galaxy, ensuring his legend endured even as his body remained chained. Vitiate, blind in his arrogance, believed he had silenced Revan, but in truth he had given him a new form of immortality, one not of flesh but of story, a presence that could not be contained by stone and stasis. Revan, though trapped, became a haunting, a whisper in the Force that reminded the galaxy that its wars were not over, that its greatest player still lingered on the board. He was the Emperor's pawn, yes, but he was also the Emperor's flaw, the reminder that even the most careful schemes could never fully master the will of a man who had already defied destiny itself. Chapter 16. The Legacy of Revan's Echo. Though Revan's body remained locked in the endless shadow of Dromund Kaas, his influence did not vanish into silence, for the Force carried him beyond the boundaries of his cell, threading his presence through visions, whispers, and dreams that touched those sensitive enough to hear them, creating ripples that shaped the galaxy long after most have forgotten his true name. In the halls of the Jedi Order, masters meditating upon the future caught fleeting glimpses of a masked figure standing at the crossroads of light and darkness, a spectre whose very existence unsettled the currents of destiny. Among the Sith, acolytes whispered of dreams in which a warrior with eyes of fire warned them of betrayals yet to come, a phantom who embodied both their ambitions and their fears. To smugglers and wanderers, he was nothing more than a half-remembered tale, the Dark Lord who had turned savior, a story told to remind children that even the greatest fall could be followed by redemption. Yet behind these fragmented stories was something more tangible, for Revan's will, though shackled, remained potent enough to project fragments of himself outward, not entire memories but impressions, warnings, and echoes of strategy that influenced events in ways subtle yet profound. It was said that KOTOR, rising through the ranks of the Republic Navy, sometimes felt as if his old comrade stood beside him in moments of decision, whispering guidance into his mind. It was said that Mandalore the Preserver, once Canderous Ordo, claimed that in battle he would hear the phantom voice of his old commander, reminding him of honor and precision, urging him to unite the clans rather than let them fracture. Even Bastila, raising their child alone, confessed in her journals that in the quiet of night she would feel Revan's presence beside her, a comfort that was not memory alone, but something alive, a tether stretched across light years and centuries. In this way, Revan became more than prisoner. He became legend incarnate, his will sustained by the paradox that had always defined him. Light bound to dark, Sith sharpened by Jedi discipline, Jedi tempered by Sith strength. And though the Emperor sought to bend him into tool and pawn, Revan's echo spread beyond his control, planting seeds of resistance that would one day bloom into defiance. His legend inspired some to rise against tyranny, others to embrace paths of balance rather than extremes, and in this influence, Revan lived on, not as flesh and blood but as myth, carried forward by the Force itself. He had once sought to save the Republic by conquering it, once sought to break the Mandalorians by becoming their equal in ruthlessness, and now, chained in silence, he shaped history not by action but by presence. The Jedi Civil War had ended, yet its scars ran deep, and in the years that followed, when whispers of Sith resurgence spread, those who remembered Revan found themselves guided by an unseen hand. Whether his echo was warning them of danger or preparing them for the greater threat of the Emperor was unknown, but what was certain was that his story refused to die. For even in chains, even when memory was stripped and will was shackled, Revan endured, and the galaxy itself carried him forward, ensuring that the name of the prodigal knight would remain forever etched into the current of the Force. Chapter 17. The exile finds Revan. Through the uncharted abyss of the unknown regions, across the scattered bones of forgotten civilizations and the broken remnants of ships swallowed by anomalies, Mitra Surik pursued the faintest trace of her old general, guided not by maps or beacons, but by instinct, visions, and the unyielding bond of loyalty that had never been severed even when the galaxy had condemned them both. Her companions urged caution, for the region devoured fleets and silenced transmissions, but Mitra pressed forward, her resolve hardened by the whispers that came in the quiet of meditation, where she felt Revan's presence flickering like a candle trapped in glass, distant yet alive. Her journey carried her at last to Dromund Kaas, the storm-racked throne world of the Sith Empire, where lightning carved jagged scars across the eternal night and jungles twisted with the weight of corruption pressed outward from the Emperor's will. It was there, beneath the looming citadel, that she found him, not the legendary general of the Mandalorian Wars, not the masked Dark Lord who had once bent the Republic to his command, but a broken figure suspended in stasis, his body preserved by unnatural energy, his mind shackled by chains of thought too heavy to be seen. At first he seemed lifeless, yet as Mitra drew closer, the force surged between them, and she felt his will struggling beneath centuries of imprisonment, battered yet unbroken, diminished yet enduring, the same Revan she had once followed into the jaws of Malak 5. She shattered the seals that bound his prison, and as the energy dissipated in a scream of ancient machinery, his eyes opened with a clarity that shook her. For though time had weighed upon him, his spirit remained alight, a paradox of light and darkness, a survivor who refused to yield. Their reunion was not one of joy, but of urgency, for the Emperor's presence pressed in upon them immediately, his shadow filling the chamber like a storm cloud, and Revan, though freed, was still bound by the lingering tendrils of domination. He spoke with urgency, his voice ragged but commanding, warning her that the Emperor was more than a ruler, more than a Sith, that he was hunger itself, a void that could not be sated, and that their escape would only draw his attention more fully upon them. Mitra steadied him, lending her strength as she once had on countless battlefields, and together they fought their way through the citadel's dark halls, Sith guards and adepts falling before their blades as they fled into the jungles of Kaas. Yet even in freedom, Revan's chains had not fully broken, for the Emperor had marked him, tethering him with a thread of will that could not easily be severed. And as they found refuge beyond the city's edge, Revan confessed the truth he had carried in silence, that the Emperor's power was too vast for a single blade to defeat, that even united they could not hope to destroy him outright. Their task was not conquest, but resistance, to delay the Emperor's designs long enough for the Republic and Jedi to awaken to the danger. Mitra, hearing this, did not falter, for her loyalty was not born of hope in victory, but of faith in him, the man who had once led her through the crucible of Malachor, and who now, even broken, bore the weight of the galaxy's survival. Together they swore to fight on, not as master and subordinate, not as savior and exile, but as two souls bound by destiny, stepping once more into the shadows of war. Chapter 18. Revan and Mitra against the Emperor. Though Revan's body was weakened by centuries of imprisonment, and his mind still bore the scars of the Emperor's domination, he and Mitra Surik did not retreat into obscurity, for their escape was not an ending but a beginning, a fragile chance to resist the tide of darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy. Together, they became phantoms in the heart of the Sith Empire, striking where they could, unraveling threads of Vitiate's vast web, and sowing seeds of dissent that might one day grow into rebellion. The jungles of Dromund Kaas became their sanctuary and their battleground, the storms above masking their movements, the force itself bending at times as if willing them to endure. Mitra, whose own exile had taught her the value of forging strength from brokenness, steadied Revan, reminding him that though his chains had left wounds upon his soul, his will had not been destroyed. And Revan, even diminished, revealed once more the brilliance that had defined him in every age, planning their every move with precision, turning scraps of intelligence into weapons, making every strike count. They targeted supply lines, eliminated Sith overseers, and spread rumors that undermined loyalty to the Emperor, always careful to strike and vanish before the Sith military could descend upon them. Yet their true battle was not only with soldiers and assassins, but with the Emperor himself, whose awareness pressed constantly upon Revan, tethered through the lingering bond of domination. At times, Vitiate's voice invaded his thoughts, mocking him, tempting him, reminding him of his failures, and in those moments it was Mitra who anchored him, her presence reminding him that he was not alone, that he fought not only for Bastila and the son he had left behind, but also for the countless innocents who would vanish into the void if the Emperor's hunger was unleashed. their bond, forged long ago on the battlefields of the Mandalorian Wars and tempered by years of exile and silence, became unbreakable, a union of will that allowed them to endure what neither could have faced alone. They gathered allies quietly, drawing to their cause those within the Empire who chafed beneath the Emperor's suffocating rule, soldiers disillusioned by endless cruelty, and spies who saw in Revan not a defeated prisoner, but a leader whose very survival was proof of hope. Yet for every step forward, the Emperor pressed harder, sending his assassins, shadowy Sith who wielded illusions, poisons, and blades honed with the dark side, to hunt them. Again and again, Revan and Mitra stood together against these foes, their blades flashing in storms of lightning, their strength drawn from trust as much as from the Force, until their names, whispered in fear, began to spread even among the Emperor's servants. Still, they knew they could not win through resistance alone. Revan confessed to Mitra that his time in captivity had given him insight into Vitiate's true nature, that the Emperor sought not merely conquest, but the annihilation of life itself, to drain entire worlds as he had drained Nathema, to consume the galaxy until nothing remained but his own eternal will. This truth hardened their purpose, for they understood their war was not for victory in their lifetime, but for survival across generations, to hold back the Emperor long enough for the Republic to awaken to the threat. And so, they endured, striking and vanishing, enduring and resisting, two blades against an empire but blades that refused to break. In their defiance, Revan and Mitra became living proof that even the most absolute darkness could be opposed, that even a will as vast as Vitiate's could be delayed, and though the Emperor sneered at their defiance, calling them pawns against inevitability, their very survival carved cracks in his certainty, for he, who believed himself eternal, could not wholly erase the light that still burned within them. Chapter 19. The Arrival of Lord Scourge. The Emperor, though patient beyond mortal reckoning, grew restless with the persistence of Revan and Mitra, for their defiance had become more than nuisance. It was a fracture in the image of inevitability he projected across his empire, a whisper that even immortality could be opposed, and so he turned to one of his most trusted weapons, Lord Scourge, the Emperor's wrath, a Sith whose loyalty was forged not by fear alone, but by the promise of purpose, the embodiment of the Emperor's judgment against all who defied him. Scourge, red-skinned and towering, had carved his legend in the blood of Jedi and Sith alike, his blade feared for its ruthless efficiency, his will unbending, his life extended by alchemy that made him a predator destined to outlast the generations he slaughtered. And when the Emperor summoned him, it was with the command not to merely hunt, but to extinguish Revan once and for all. Guided by intelligence extracted from spies and visions granted by the dark side, Scourge descended upon the jungles of Dromund Kos, his presence a storm that even the beasts recoiled from. And he found not cowards hiding in shadows, but warriors who met him blade to blade, for Revan and Mitra did not flee from the wrath. They confronted him head-on. The clash was titanic, lightning crackling above as sabers ignited below, Revan and Mitra fighting in seamless tandem, their strikes balanced between his measured precision and her relentless will, while Scourge met them with the fury of a living weapon honed by centuries of slaughter. For long minutes, the storm of their battle raged, sparks flying as blades screamed against one another, and though Scourge had been sent to destroy, he began to sense what the Emperor, in his arrogance, had not. This was no broken prisoner and no wandering exile, but two figures whose defiance was rooted in purpose deeper than ambition or survival. They fought not for themselves, but for the galaxy, and the Force itself seemed to weave around them, lending weight to their strikes. Again and again, Scourge pressed his advantage, yet again and again they turned him back, until at last he realized that even if he struck them down, their will would not die. Their legend would only grow, and in that moment, doubt took root within the wrath of the Emperor. For Scourge, whose entire existence had been defined by obedience to Vitiate, began to wonder if perhaps the eternal Emperor was not invincible, if perhaps the true current of destiny flowed not with the Sith who devoured worlds, but with the Jedi who refused to surrender. Still, loyalty bound him, and though he withdrew that day without victory, it was not failure alone that guided him. It was curiosity, the first fracture in his servitude, the realization that Revan and Mitra might be more than fugitives. They might be the very fulcrum upon which the future would turn. And so Scourge, the weapon sent to slay them, became instead a watcher, circling their path, testing their strength, and waiting for the moment when destiny itself would force him to choose between the Emperor he had always served and the light he had long denied. Chapter 20. The Exile's Search. Mitra Surik had walked away from the Jedi long ago, her name spoken in whispers as the exile who had unleashed the mass shadow generator at Malachor V, a weapon that had scarred the Force itself and severed her from its current, leaving her adrift for years in silence. She had wandered from world to world as a ghost, carrying guilt heavier than any burden of exile, yet in her solitude she found a strange clarity, an understanding of the wounds war carved not only into planets but into souls. When the galaxy called her back, it was not the Council that summoned her, but the Force itself. For one by one, Jedi Masters were vanishing into shadow, their presences extinguished by predators unseen, and though she had sworn never to return, she could not ignore the pull. Her journey began with reluctance, yet companions gathered around her as though drawn by destiny itself, mirroring the path of the general she had once followed into the Mandalorian Wars. Atton Rand, the scoundrel with secrets carved into his past, joined her aboard the Ebon Hawk, his cynicism masking the loyalty he would later reveal. Baldur, the Zabrak engineer scarred both in body and spirit by Malachor, returned to her side, still haunted by the weapon he had helped create. Visas Ma, once bound to the Sith Lord Nihilus, offered her devotion and insight, her blindness offset by vision deeper than sight. Even Canderous Ordo, reborn as Mandalore, answered her call, drawn once again to a leader whose resolve reminded him of Revan. And through Kreia, the enigmatic mentor who both guided and manipulated her, Mitra found her connection to the Force slowly restored. Her exile ending as she embraced not the dogma of the Council but the truth of her own will. Across the galaxy, she fought the Sith Triumvirate, Nihilus, the Lord of Hunger whose very presence devoured life, Sion, the Lord of Pain whose body was shattered yet sustained by hatred, and Kreia herself, revealed at last as Darth Trier, the betrayer who sought to unravel the Force entirely. Through each trial, Mitra grew not only stronger, but more certain that the Jedi and the Sith were two halves of a broken whole, their endless cycle of war blind to the greater shadow that loomed beyond the galaxy's edge. And when the Triumvirate was broken, and the Jedi remnants rallied once more, she did not remain to rebuild the Order, or seek vindication for her exile. Instead, she turned her gaze outward, into the darkness where Revan had vanished. She felt him in her dreams, a presence she knew more intimately than she knew herself, for she had marched at his side across the fires of Malachor, had seen in him the same brilliance and burden that now pressed upon her shoulders. To the Republic she was savior, to the Jedi she was exile no longer, but to herself she was only a seeker, driven by a bond that distance and time could not erode. The maps of the Republic ended at the unknown regions, but her course was set by something greater than stars. She would find him, she swore, even if it carried her beyond the edge of the galaxy. For though the galaxy celebrated peace once more, she knew what few others could feel. That the war Revan had foreseen was not yet over, that the Emperor he had sought to destroy still lurked in the shadows, and that her place was not in temples or councils, but in the void, where Revan's light flickered like a candle struggling against a storm. And so she departed, carrying with her the loyalty of those who had fought at her side, yet ultimately alone, a solitary figure stepping into the abyss, not for glory or redemption, but for devotion, for duty, and for the man whose story had always been bound to her own. Chapter 21. Reunion in the Shadows. The storms of Dromund Kaas roared like the wrath of the gods as Mitra Surik descended into the jungle world that stank of corruption, its endless lightning tearing the sky apart as if to warn her that she had come too far. Yet she pressed onward, guided not by star charts or sensors, but by the steady pull of the Force, a beacon that had haunted her dreams until she could no longer deny its call. Through the dripping canopies and jagged cliffs, she carved her path, the air heavy with the weight of the dark side, beasts warped by it, lunging from the undergrowth only to be cut down by the exile's blade, her focus unbroken, her determination unshaken. At last, the jungle gave way to the shadow of the Emperor's citadel, a monolithic fortress of obsidian rising from the storm-lashed cliffs like a wound upon the world, its spires piercing the clouds, its walls thrumming with power that was more than stone, more than design. It was will, the Emperor's will, pressing down upon all who dared to trespass. Mitra moved through its halls like a ghost, striking down guards with swift precision, slipping through shadows with the quiet certainty of one who had lived too long in exile to be shaken by fear. And then, deep within the heart of that citadel, she found him, a chamber alive with energy that hummed like 1,000 whispers, at its center a figure suspended in stasis, unmoving yet alive, bound by tendrils of the force that wrapped around him like chains. It was Revan, though not as she remembered him, for centuries of imprisonment had carved hollows in his presence, his body unaged yet marked by weariness that could not be seen with the eye, only felt through the force. As she stepped closer, his eyes fluttered open, and in that instant the years fell away, for within the tired gaze was the same fire that had once carried her across Malak's broken fields, the same will that had led armies and defied councils. Her name left his lips not as sound, but as a thought pressed into her mind, a whisper of recognition that cut through the chains binding him, and as her lightsaber sliced through the mechanisms that sustained his captivity, the prison cracked and collapsed in a storm of sparks. He stumbled forward, weakened, his steps uncertain, yet when she caught him he was not broken, only reshaped, a man tempered by centuries of torment whose spirit had refused to yield. Their reunion was brief, for the Emperor's presence pressed upon them at once, an awareness that filled the chamber like a tide of suffocating darkness, his voice echoing in their minds with scorn and promise of annihilation. Together they fled, blades flashing through the corridors as Sith guards poured forth to contain them, and though Revan's body faltered, Mitra's strength carried them onward, the two fighting as they once had long ago, not as master and general, not as Jedi in exile, but as comrades bound by loyalty that had survived even time itself. When at last they reached the storm-lashed jungles, their lungs burning, their clothes soaked with rain and blood, they paused beneath the twisted boughs, lightning raking the sky above, and Revan looked upon Mitra with gratitude that words could not hold, telling her that she had not only freed him, but restored the part of him the Emperor could never touch, the belief that he was not alone. And in her steady gaze, he found not pity for his suffering, but faith. The same faith she had once placed in him on the fields of war, the faith that together they might defy even an emperor who claimed eternity. Chapter 22. The Wrath of the Emperor. The Emperor did not rage at the escape of his prisoner, for his patience was eternal and his will unshaken, but in the silence of his dark council chambers he summoned a weapon more precise than fury, more relentless than armies, for he called forth Lord Scourge, the wrath of the Emperor, a pure-blooded Sith whose crimson skin bore the markings of his lineage and whose life had been extended by alchemical rites that made him a predator bound to the Emperor's will until the end of days. Scourge was no mere servant, but the living embodiment of judgment, unleashed only when the Emperor's wrath demanded it, and when he was tasked with finding and destroying Revan and the Jedi exile, he accepted with the certainty of one who had never failed in his purpose. Guided by intelligence gathered from Sith agents and by the whispers of the Force that carried the echo of Revan's defiance, Scourge descended into the storm-lashed jungles of Dromund Kaas, where lightning split the sky and shadows shifted with the promise of violence. He found them there, Revan and Mitra Surik, fugitives who had dared to break chains thought unbreakable, and he ignited his crimson blade without hesitation, his voice declaring that their resistance ended in this place. The clash was immediate and thunderous, three lightsabers cutting the storm-lit air, the jungle alive with the crack of lightning and the hiss of blades colliding. Revan, still weakened from centuries of imprisonment, fought with precision and cunning, every strike measured, every parry designed to expose flaws, while Mitra moved with relentless energy, her exile having honed her into a warrior whose resilience defied exhaustion. Scourge met them with the fury of the dark side itself, each blow fueled by hatred, his movements precise and devastating, his every strike a test of their endurance. The battle raged through the trees, lightning illuminating faces carved with determination, rain hissing against sabers as mud churned beneath their feet. And though Scourge pressed them with the certainty of execution, he began to sense something the Emperor had not foreseen. These two did not fight merely for survival or ambition, as so many Sith did, but with a unity born of loyalty and trust, a bond the dark side could not easily unravel. Again and again he struck, and again they turned him back until doubt, an unfamiliar shadow, stirred within him. Scourge, bred for obedience and shaped into a weapon of fear, found himself questioning, for he saw in Revan's defiance and Mitra's loyalty a strength unlike any he had ever encountered, a strength that whispered of destiny beyond even the Emperor's sight. Still, his orders bound him, and though he withdrew at last into the storm, the fight unresolved, his heart was unsettled. He had seen what the Emperor could not admit, that Revan and Mitra carried with them the possibility of change, the possibility of defiance against inevitability, and though he had been sent to destroy them, part of him now wondered if instead his fate was to join them. Chapter 23. Alliance with the Wrath. Scourge did not return to the Emperor with tales of failure, for failure was a word that carried no meaning in the service of eternity, but rather he lingered in the storms of Dromund Kos, his crimson blade extinguished as his thoughts churned with a weight he had never allowed himself to feel before. For the duel against Revan and Mitra had not ended in victory, nor in death, but in revelation, and that revelation gnawed at the certainty that had defined his existence. All his life he had served as the wrath of the Emperor, the living blade of vitiate's judgment, the executioner who ended those who defied the throne, and yet in the eyes of Revan he had seen something that unsettled him more than fear or hatred. He had seen conviction, a fire that even centuries of chains had failed to extinguish, a will that stood unbending even when crushed beneath the most absolute darkness. In Mitra Surik he had seen loyalty that bordered on devotion, a strength forged not in ambition but in sacrifice, and together they had fought not as master and servant, but as equals, their unity giving them a power Scourge had never witnessed among the Sith, who were bound always by treachery and rivalry. In the days that followed their clash, Scourge shadowed them, testing his instincts, watching as they struck against the Emperor's networks with precision and patience, unraveling plots, destroying supply lines, and liberating slaves with the purpose that was not conquest, but resistance. He confronted them again, not with blade, but with words, his voice cold as he demanded to know why they fought, why they resisted a will that had devoured worlds, why they struggled when the Emperor's victory seemed inevitable. Revan answered not with rhetoric but with truth, telling Scourge that the Emperor's hunger was not conquest but annihilation, that his ambition was not empire but the destruction of all life, and that to serve him was to serve the end of existence itself. Mitra added her voice, reminding Scourge that loyalty to such a vision was not strength but slavery, that the true measure of power was not in domination but in the freedom to choose one's path. Their words struck deeper than any blow, for though Scourge had always believed his servitude was survival, he now glimpsed the possibility that it was cowardice, that his fear of the Emperor had blinded him to the truth that even eternity could be resisted. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered his guard, confessing that his visions had shown him fragments of destiny, glimpses of a battle where the Emperor was not triumphant, and in those visions he had seen Revan and Mitra at the center, not as pawns, but as fulcrums upon which the galaxy turned. Bound by that vision and by the seed of doubt now rooted in his heart, Scourge made his choice. He bent the knee, not as servant, but as ally, pledging his blade to their cause, declaring that if destiny demanded the Emperor's fall, then he would stand beside those destined to strike the blow. Revan accepted him with wary caution, knowing the nature of Sith was ever treacherous, but within the Force he sensed a shift, a fracture in the Emperor's perfect dominion. Mitra offered her trust more readily, for she believed in redemption born of choice, and in that moment the three were bound together: Revan, the prodigal knight reborn; Mitra, the exile who had returned; and Scourge, the wrath of the Emperor turned against his master. Their alliance was uneasy, fragile as glass, but it was enough to shape a plan that would carry them into the very heart of the throne, where destiny itself waited, patient and merciless, to test the measure of their defiance. Chapter 24. The Attempt on the Emperor's Life. The storm over Dromund Kaas reached its crescendo as Revan, Mitra, and Scourge made their way into the Emperor's citadel, their steps heavy with the weight of destiny, for each of them knew this was no mere strike against a ruler, no ordinary assassination attempt, but a confrontation with a being whose existence stretched beyond mortality, a creature of hunger that had consumed his own world and now sought to devour the galaxy. Their plan had been shaped by Revan's brilliance, Mitra's resilience, and Scourge's knowledge of the Empire's labyrinthine fortresses, every move calculated with precision, every step drawn from hard-earned understanding of their foe. And yet even with such care they knew their odds were fragile, for the Emperor's will stretched into every stone, every shadow, every heartbeat within his domain. Through the darkened halls they moved, striking swiftly and silently, cutting down Sith guards and apprentices who stood in their path, each battle more a test of endurance than skill. For the deeper they pressed, the more oppressive the air became, the Force itself thick with the Emperor's presence until each breath felt like a struggle against drowning. Yet they endured, their unity forging a path through the suffocating darkness, and at last they entered the great throne chamber where Vitiate awaited them. He did not rise when they arrived, did not ignite a blade or summon guards, but sat upon his seat of obsidian, his eyes gleaming with a light that was not life but hunger. And when he spoke, his voice was not sound, but a tide of thought that poured into their minds, mocking, belittling, promising them death and oblivion. Revan stepped forward, his violet blade igniting in defiance, and in that moment the duel began not merely with sabers, but with wills colliding like stars. Lightning cascaded from the Emperor's hands, dark energy erupting in torrents that shattered the floor, and Revan met it with the strength of the Force, his body trembling, but his spirit refusing to yield. Mitra fought at his side, her blade flashing as she carved through illusions and summoned creatures of shadow, each one a manifestation of the Emperor's boundless malice, her determination unshaken even as her strength faltered beneath the onslaught. Scourge, too, fought with every ounce of his might, his crimson saber cutting arcs through the air, his loyalty no longer to the Emperor, but to the vision that had drawn him here, the vision of Revan's defiance. The battle raged with a fury that shook the chamber, stone shattering, air burning with the clash of energies, and for a moment it seemed as though they might prevail, for together they pushed the Emperor back, their unity carving cracks in his perfect dominion. Yet even as victory seemed within reach, the Force turned, and Scourge was seized by a vision so profound it froze his blade mid-swing. He saw the future stretch out before him, saw Revan and Mitra fall in this chamber, their deaths leaving the galaxy defenseless against the Emperor's eternal hunger, saw centuries of darkness and annihilation, and then saw another figure, one not yet born into this era, who would one day stand before Vitiate and succeed where they could not. In that moment, Scourge understood the cruel paradox of destiny, that their attempt, no matter how valiant, was not meant to succeed, and that for the sake of the galaxy he must betray them. With a roar torn from his soul, he turned upon his allies, striking not to kill, but to distract, his betrayal giving the Emperor the opening he needed. A storm of power erupted from Vitiate, slamming into Revan and Mitra with force so absolute it tore through their defenses and cast them broken to the ground. Mitra, her body shattered, gave her life in that instant, her last act one of loyalty as she shielded Revan from the killing blow, and in her sacrifice she became the final echo of devotion that defined her existence. Revan, broken and bleeding, reached for her as the darkness consumed her, his cry silenced by the Emperor's laughter, and then the void claimed him. Scourge knelt before his master, feigning loyalty once more. Yet within him the vision lingered, the certainty that his betrayal had not been for cowardice, but for the preservation of the future, a future where the true champion destined to end the Emperor would rise. And so Revan was taken once more, imprisoned in stasis deep within the Emperor's citadel, his will chained but not destroyed, his spirit fractured between light and dark, while the galaxy beyond continued in ignorance of how close it had come to destruction. The attempt had failed, yet in its failure destiny had been shaped, for Revan's survival would echo through centuries, his influence seeping into both Jedi and Sith. His story unfinished, his legacy not yet written to its end. Chapter 25. Revan Divided. Imprisonment returned to Revan like a familiar curse, but this time it was not the silent, solitary confinement of his first captivity, where centuries had passed in a haze of illusions and torment, but something far more insidious, for the Emperor, strengthened by his victory and the betrayal of Scourge, sought not merely to chain Revan's body, but to fracture his very essence. Suspended once more in stasis within the depths of the citadel, Revan's mind became a battlefield upon which the light and dark of his soul clashed endlessly, his will no longer a singular flame but a divided storm. On one side there remained the part of him that had chosen redemption, the Revan who had walked beside Bastila, who had fought for the Republic, who had been willing to face his own sins to protect a future beyond himself. This fragment was calm and resolute, clinging to hope even in despair, projecting his presence outward into the galaxy like a whisper of guidance, a beacon that touched Jedi and allies across generations, reminding them that defiance was never in vain. On the other side, however, festered the darkness that had once worn the mask of Darth Revan, the cunning and ruthless mind that had sought to conquer the Republic not out of hunger for power, but out of the conviction that only through fire could the galaxy be forged strong enough to survive the storm he had foreseen. This darker fragment raged against captivity, impatient and merciless, and it grew stronger with every moment the Emperor fed upon his mind, taking in his knowledge of war, his strategies, his brilliance, until it became a distinct will, separate from the man he had once been. Thus, Revan became two beings in one, split between the light that sought to endure and the dark that sought to dominate, each sustained by the paradox that had always defined him, each whispering across the centuries until his name became both a promise and a threat. The Emperor found in this fracture a use, for he harnessed the darker side to strengthen his empire, to inspire the cultists and Sith who began to worship Revan not as prisoner, but as a godlike figure, their teachings twisted into the doctrine of the Revanites, a secret order that preached his return as inevitable. Yet even as his shadow was turned into a tool of the Sith, the light within him refused to die, seeping outward into the currents of the Force, touching the dreams of Jedi, planting warnings, preparing them for wars yet to come. In this strange and terrible division, Revan achieved a form of immortality, his name and his will persisting across centuries, even as his body remained trapped in eternal suspension, his mind locked in conflict with itself. He was no longer one man, but two truths coexisting, the savior who had once redeemed himself and the conqueror who still believed only through domination could survival be achieved. And as the centuries stretched on, this division would ensure that when Revan returned, he would not return as the man he had once been, but as something far greater and far more dangerous. A being who embodied both salvation and destruction, whose every step would shape the galaxy in ways neither Jedi nor Sith could fully comprehend. Chapter 26. The Revanite Cult. As centuries passed and the galaxy turned through cycles of war and fragile peace, Revan's body remained trapped in the Emperor's stasis prison, but his divided spirit refused to be contained, and from that paradox grew something unexpected and enduring, a cult of worshippers who called themselves the Revanites, men and women within the Sith Empire and beyond, who believed that Revan's path, neither holy Jedi nor holy Sith, was the truest way to strength and survival. What began as whispers in the dark halls of Droman Caste spread like wildfire through the undercurrents of the Empire, initiated by those who had felt Revan's fractured presence within the Force, his darker aspects seeping into dreams and visions, promising power, unity, and clarity beyond the endless infighting of Sith tradition. These first disciples, many of them disillusioned acolytes or ambitious soldiers, gathered in secret beneath the jungle canopies and in the storm-ravaged ruins of Kar City, speaking the words of a masked prophet they had never seen, but whom they believed would return to lead them. They rejected the blind obedience demanded by the Emperor, proclaiming that the Sith way of constant betrayal was weakness, and they dismissed the Jedi ideal of restraint as cowardice, declaring instead that true power came from balance, passion guided by discipline, freedom bound by purpose, a creed that mirrored the paradox Revan himself had embodied. Their rituals were simple yet profound, meditation upon Revan's legacy, recitations of his victories, and initiations where acolytes were asked to discard their old allegiances and don masks as symbols of transformation. Over time, their numbers grew, swelling with Sith disillusioned by the Emperor's silence and citizens who longed for a leader who offered purpose rather than endless war, until the Revanites became a movement hidden within the very heart of the Empire. In taverns and training halls, in the whispers of soldiers marching to unseen fronts, the name of Revan returned not as a curse but as a promise, that one day he would rise again to lead them into an era where the galaxy's chaos would be reforged into order. Even among the Republic and the Jedi, echoes of his light-sided essence carried through visions, stirring curiosity and reverence for the man who had once redeemed himself and saved the Republic from Malak. Thus, both halves of Revan, the savior and the conqueror, gained followers, each shaping the myth into their own image until he became less a man and more an idea, a symbol claimed by all sides. The Jedi remembered him as a warning, the Sith revered him as a template for mastery, and the Revanites worshipped him as the one who transcended both. In this way, his divided soul shaped the galaxy long before his body ever left its prison, for cultists spread influence in politics, infiltrated military ranks, and whispered to those sensitive in the Force that destiny itself bent toward the masked figure who would one day return. And when that day finally came, when the prison chains weakened and the Force itself seemed to tremble with anticipation, it was not as a simple Jedi or Sith that Revan would re-emerge, but as the living embodiment of the cult that bore his name, a figure of worship and terror, a messiah and a tyrant, destined to remind the galaxy that his story was far from finished. Chapter 27, Revan's Return. The prison that had bound Revan for centuries was not eternal. For though the Emperor's power was vast and his domination relentless, the Force itself seemed to strain against such unnatural confinement, and as time moved forward, the cracks in the cage widened, fed both by the persistence of Revan's divided will and by the fervor of those who worshipped him in secret. The Revanites, by now a sprawling movement embedded deep within the Empire, had grown bold, their devotion channeling energy and belief into the shadow of their master, and through their rituals, their meditations, and their constant invocation of his name, they unwittingly fed the dark fragment of Revan's soul, strengthening it until it pressed against the stasis field like a storm seeking to break free. At the same time, the light within him reached outward, calling across the galaxy, guiding Jedi, Republic agents, and even those within the Sith Empire to recognize the greater threat of Vitiate's eternal hunger. Thus, the two halves of Revan, once bound together within one man, pulled in opposite directions until the prison could no longer contain them, and with a shudder that rippled across the Force, he awoke. His body, preserved unnaturally, stirred within the chamber, and though frail at first, his eyes burned with the fire of both sides of his nature, compassion and ruthlessness, wisdom and arrogance, light and dark. His escape was not a simple act of flight, but a war of wills, for even as he struggled against his bindings, the Emperor's influence sought to drag him back into submission, yet Revan's endurance, tempered by centuries, proved too fierce to extinguish. With the aid of allies who answered the call, Republic forces guided by visions, defectors within the Empire, and cultists who believed they served their savior, Revan was freed from his prison, the explosion of released energy sending tremors through Dromund Kaas itself, lightning cracking louder than ever as if the world screamed in protest. The galaxy felt his return as a wound and as a beacon, Jedi sensing a shift in the Force, Sith trembling with recognition that the masked Dark Lord of old had risen anew, and across battlefields, soldiers whispered the name as both prayer and curse. Yet the man who emerged was not the Revan of the past. He was not the bright-eyed Jedi prodigy who had once asked questions in the temple halls, nor the ruthless Sith Lord who had commanded fleets from the Starforge, nor even the redeemed knight who had stood against Malak. He was all of them and none of them, his soul fractured into light and dark, his will a storm that pulled in two directions at once. The light within him sought to preserve the Republic, to shield Bastila and the son he had left behind, to honor the sacrifices of Mitra Surik and the companions who had trusted him. The dark within him hungered to finish what had been interrupted, to wield the strength of conquest and fire to forge the galaxy into unity, to tear down the Emperor not only for justice, but for supremacy. In his return, he carried both salvation and destruction, and the galaxy would soon learn that the line between them was thinner than anyone dared imagine. To his followers, he was the long-awaited Messiah. To his enemies, he was a nightmare resurrected. But to the Force itself, he was the paradox made flesh, the proof that light and dark could exist within one being, not in harmony but in perpetual conflict. His story was not over, it had merely entered its most dangerous chapter. Chapter 28, The Shadow of the Revanites. With Revan's return, the cult that had whispered his name in secret for centuries emerged from the shadows emboldened, transforming from a hidden movement into a force that sought to shape the galaxy according to their master's paradoxical vision, and though fractured by their own interpretations of his legacy, they rallied under the belief that his survival was proof of destiny. In the heart of the Sith Empire, disillusioned soldiers and acolytes donned masks in reverence, abandoning loyalty to the Emperor in favor of Revan's teachings, convinced that balance between light and dark offered a truer path to power than endless betrayal. In the Republic, agents and Force sensitives who felt his presence in visions began to question the Jedi Council's rigid orthodoxy, whispering that Revan had seen truths they still refused to acknowledge. Thus, the Revanite movement spread like fire, infiltrating both factions, sowing doubt, gathering resources, and preparing for the day when Revan himself would step forward, not as fugitive or prisoner, but as leader. Yet the Revanites were not united in purpose, for just as Revan's soul was divided between compassion and ruthlessness, so too were his followers split. Some believed he would return as savior, a guiding light who would shield the galaxy from the Emperor's hunger, while others believed he would emerge as conqueror, a dark lord who would burn away weakness and forge a new order through fire and steel. This division made them unpredictable and dangerous, for in their fervor they carried out plots across both Republic and Imperial space, assassinating leaders, stealing artifacts, and striking military convoys, their actions always cloaked in the rhetoric of destiny. To the Republic, they were a rogue sect of Sith infiltrators. To the Empire, they were heretics defying the eternal Emperor. But to themselves, they were the truest disciples of a man who had transcended both Jedi and Sith. In the chaos of their rise, Revan himself became mythic, his fractured presence feeding into both halves of the cult, the light side guiding them toward visions of unity, the dark side urging conquest and domination, and neither fully aware that they were following pieces of a soul that no longer spoke with one voice. Revan's paradox echoed in every mask they wore, every ritual they performed, every battle they waged, and the galaxy trembled as the cult grew bold enough to declare openly that the future belonged not to the Emperor nor to the Council, but to Revan. Fleets began to rally beneath their banner, bases sprang up in forgotten corners of space, and whispers spread of a hidden armada preparing for war. The Revanites had stepped into the light of history, and with their rise came the chilling certainty that their master's story, far from ended, had become a storm poised to engulf everything once more. Chapter 29. The final confrontation. The galaxy had endured centuries of Revan's shadow, first as the prodigal Jedi who defied the Council, then as the Dark Lord who nearly crushed the Republic, later as the redeemed knight who destroyed the Starforge, and finally as the prisoner whose divided soul whispered across generations, and now, at last, he returned not as myth, but as leader, standing at the head of the Revanite movement that had grown into an army vast enough to shake both Republic and Empire. His followers, masked and fervent, saw him as the embodiment of destiny, the one who had transcended death itself, and under his command they rallied ships, soldiers, and Sith defectors into a war machine designed for one singular purpose: to annihilate the Sith Emperor once and for all. In Revan's fractured mind, light and dark coexisted uneasily, yet in this cause they found common ground, for both halves of his soul despised the hunger that had consumed Nathema and threatened the galaxy entire. Yet the means by which he pursued this end revealed the split within him. His light sought liberation, a galaxy freed from the Emperor's shadow, while his dark sought domination, the forging of a republic remade through fire so that it might survive what was to come. The Republic, though wary, could not ignore his charisma, and some whispered of an alliance. The Empire, though fractured, feared the Revanites' heresy, for their loyalty was no longer to Vitiate, but to a man who had once been both Jedi and Sith. Thus, in a twist of destiny no one had foreseen, Republic and Empire alike found themselves forced into uneasy union, recognizing that if Revan was left unchecked, his war would consume them all. The battle that followed was apocalyptic, fought not on a single front but across fleets and worlds, as Revan's armada surged from hidden bases, his followers hurling themselves into combat with fanatical devotion. At its heart, Revan himself stood, commanding with the brilliance that had once broken Mandalorians and humbled Jedi, his every strategy turning the tide, his presence in battle an inspiration that made his followers fight with the certainty that they could not fail. Yet even as his armies clashed, the true confrontation lay within him, for the fracture of his soul grew deeper, the light pulling toward sacrifice, the dark toward victory at any cost, until even his allies struggled to know whether the man they followed sought to save the galaxy or to bend it beneath his will. The final duel came upon Yavin 4, beneath the ancient temples where the Force pulled thick and the echoes of long-dead Sith Lords whispered in the stone. There, Revan's forces clashed with the combined strength of Jedi, Sith, and Republic soldiers, a unity forged not by trust, but by necessity, and at the heart of the storm, Revan faced them, his violet blade clashing against dozens, his will bending the battlefield itself. He fought like a man possessed, for in truth he was two men at war with one another, his strikes fueled by compassion and cruelty in equal measure, his voice shifting between the savior who begged his enemies to understand and the tyrant who demanded their surrender. The battle raged until at last the combined weight of the galaxy bore down upon him, Jedi and Sith striking together, the Force itself straining beneath the paradox of his existence, and Revan fell. But even in defeat he did not die, for the fracture within him had made him more than mortal, and as his body collapsed, his spirit split once more, the light ascending into the Force, whispering peace, while the dark clung to the world of the living, feeding upon rage and devotion, sustaining the Revanite faithful who swore that their master would never truly be gone. The battlefield fell silent, the Revanite army shattered, but across the galaxy the name of Revan continued to echo, not as hero or villain alone, but as both, a figure whose legacy refused to end, a reminder that the line between light and dark was never as absolute as the Jedi or Sith believed. The final confrontation had ended, but Revan's shadow remained, woven forever into the destiny of the galaxy. Chapter 30. The Legacy of Revan. Even after his fall upon Yavin 4, when his fractured spirit was finally torn apart, half dissolving into the luminous flow of the Force and half lingering as a shadow bound to memory and devotion, Revan's presence did not fade from the galaxy, for he had become something more enduring than flesh, more influential than armies. He had become legend, and legends cannot die. Among the Jedi, his story was told in whispers, some recounting him as a cautionary tale of the dangers of passion and arrogance, others as proof that even those who stumble deepest into the dark can still find the path back to the light. For Padawans who struggled with doubt, his name was invoked as reassurance that mistakes need not define a lifetime. For masters, his memory was a reminder that wisdom must never be mistaken for infallibility, for the Council's refusal to act in the Mandalorian Wars had birthed both a savior and a Sith. Among the Sith, Revan was revered not as traitor but as template, a figure who had seized power, bent empires, and wielded knowledge of both sides of the Force to create an identity beyond dogma. And though they spat at his redemption, they admired his defiance, his brilliance, and his ability to make the galaxy tremble. To the Revanites who survived his downfall, he was immortal. The mask and the name passed from one generation to the next, a symbol of balance, of transcendence, of a destiny that could not be chained to either Jedi Code or Sith Creed. In the Republic, he was remembered as both curse and savior, the man who had once brought it to its knees, but who had also destroyed the Starforge and turned the tide of the Jedi Civil War, his contradictions woven into every history that dared speak his name. Bastila Shan, left to raise their child alone, carried the memory of the man she had loved, not with bitterness but with reverence, teaching their son that his father had been both flawed and great, that the weight of Revan's choices had shaped the galaxy more profoundly than any other in their time. And even centuries later, when new wars consumed the stars, when the Sith rose and fell in endless cycles, when empires shattered and were rebuilt, Revan's presence lingered in the Force, his echo guiding, warning, and inspiring those who opened themselves to its currents. For Revan was more than a man. He was the embodiment of the galaxy's eternal struggle, the paradox of light and dark, savior and destroyer, Jedi and Sith, a reminder that the Force itself was not a dichotomy but a spectrum, and that true power lay not in choosing one side but in understanding both. His name became prayer and curse, inspiration and warning, and his mask, whether buried in tombs or raised by cultists, endured as one of the most recognizable symbols in galactic history. And so, though his body had fallen and his soul had fractured, Revan's legacy lived on, carved into the destiny of the galaxy, proof that a single life, forged in defiance, devotion, and paradox, could ripple across millennia and remind all who followed that the line between hero and villain is often nothing more than the choices made when the galaxy stands upon the edge of destruction. Chapter 31. Revan's Enduring Myth. Revan's story did not end with his death, nor even with the scattering of his cult or the silence of his mask, for what remained was something larger than the man himself, something that endured in temples, in archives, in battlefields, and in the quiet meditations of those who still saw answers where the Jedi Code and Sith Code faltered. His myth lived because it was not simple, because he was not easily defined, because he embodied contradiction and forced the galaxy to confront truths it preferred to bury. To the Jedi, he was the reminder that inaction could be as dangerous as corruption, that when the Council refused to act in the Mandalorian Wars, it was their silence that helped birth a Dark Lord who nearly destroyed the Republic. To the Sith, he was the exemplar of mastery, a figure who had united cunning, charisma, and will, bending both Jedi training and Sith philosophy to his own design, proof that true power lay in transcending limits rather than obeying them. To the Republic, he was the paradox of savior and traitor, the man who had led fleets against them, but also the man who had destroyed the Starforge and ended the Jedi Civil War. To the Revanites, his followers scattered but not silenced, he was prophet and Messiah, the eternal master who had proven that neither light nor dark held monopoly on truth. His myth grew because every generation found in him what they needed: redemption, warning, inspiration, or fear. Soldiers remembered the general who had outwitted Mandalorians. Jedi remembered the knight who had fallen and returned. Sith remembered the Dark Lord who had ruled with brilliance. And through them all, the Force remembered, carrying the echo of his presence across centuries, ensuring his name was never forgotten. Even in the Old Republic's later conflicts, when new heroes rose and fell, when other Sith emperors and warlords scarred the galaxy, the shadow of Revan lingered, invoked by those who claimed to follow his path or feared his return. His myth endured because it was not bound to one lesson but to many, because he represented the truth that the Force itself was not absolute, that it bent and flowed and reflected the choices of those who wielded it. In him, the galaxy saw both its greatest failure and its greatest hope, and so his legend became eternal, passed down not only in the words of historians and cultists, but in the stories told in cantinas, in the whispers of apprentices to their masters, in the thoughts of soldiers staring into the void before battle. Revan had lived, had fought, had fallen, had risen, had defied both Jedi and Sith, had been prisoner, savior, conqueror, and exile. And though his body was gone, the myth of the man in the mask remained, enduring as one of the most complex and powerful tales the galaxy had ever known. For in the end, Revan was not merely Jedi, not merely Sith, not merely hero or villain. He was all of them, and it was in that paradox that his immortality was forged. Chapter 32. Conclusion of the Prodigal Knight. In the end, the story of Revan is not the tale of a Jedi nor of a Sith, nor even of a single man who rose and fell, but the story of the Force itself as it flowed through one life more profoundly than most could ever endure, shaping him into a vessel of both brilliance and tragedy. He was the boy taken from his family and molded by the Jedi Order, whose questions could not be silenced and whose hunger for truth carried him beyond the narrow limits of orthodoxy. He was the general who defied his masters, who stood on KOTOR and vowed never to turn away from injustice, who led armies into the fires of the Mandalorian Wars and won by wielding ruthlessness equal to his enemies. He was the conqueror who uncovered the Starforge and declared himself Darth Revan, Dark Lord of the Sith, bending fleets and worlds beneath his command, not from lust for power, but from the conviction that only through his vision could the galaxy survive what lay ahead. He was the betrayed, struck down by his apprentice Malak and spared by Bastila, his memory erased so that he might live anew, his path winding back toward the light as he rediscovered compassion, loyalty, and love. He was the savior who destroyed the Forge, the husband who left Bastila behind with their unborn child, the seeker who journeyed into the unknown regions to confront the Emperor whose shadow had orchestrated so much suffering. He was the prisoner who endured centuries of torment, the divided soul whose echo shaped generations, the leader of a cult that carried his name, the warrior who returned to the galaxy, fractured between light and dark, and the figure who fought until his last breath against both the Emperor and the destiny that sought to consume him. And yet beyond all of these truths, Revan was something simpler. He was choice. Every path he walked, every mask he wore, every victory and failure alike came not from destiny imposed upon him, but from the decisions he made, decisions that carried consequences for millennia. His story endures because it reveals that the Force is not a matter of absolutes, but of choices, that one being can embody contradiction, fall into darkness, and still reach for light, conquer, and still protect, destroy, and still redeem. Revan's journey reminds us that the struggle between Jedi and Sith, between light and dark, is not war between opposites, but a reflection of the same current flowing through every soul, and that to live is to wrestle with those currents and choose again and again what one will be. He was called Prodigal Knight, Dark Lord, Redeemer, and Destroyer, but in the end, he was Revan, neither hero nor villain alone, but a man whose choices echoed louder than death, whose legacy transcended the limits of his life, and whose story, even when concluded, will never be silenced so long as the Force endures.